Okay, guys, today we're going to take a couple of minutes here to talk a little bit about the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas and the Middle Passage more specifically, too. Today we're going to kind of talk about and look at the fact that the slave trade was seen somewhat as a necessity by the Europeans because they were going to a new world. They wanted to find a cheap form of labor in that new world in order to help them, obviously in the long run, make money for themselves, gain more power, so on and so forth. So when we talk about the slave trade, we're kind of looking at it from 2 points of view here, and that is the Africans as well as the Europeans. When the Europeans initially got to the Americas, they found a source of labor there in the Native Americans. The only problem with that is that the Europeans had no clue about the land area, so it was very easy for the Native Americans to escape from them and to get away and hide elsewhere, and they were constantly losing a form of labor. So therefore, they had to find a new cheap source of labor to kind of help them work in these particular areas of the world. And the idea popped in their head, well, we know about Africa. Okay, so basically they decided to enslave Africans because they would be bringing them over from Africa. It would be a new land. They would have no real understanding of this land, so they would be kind of dependent upon the Europeans. Plus the fact that the Europeans, as we've talked about before in class, knew about the slave trade in Africa, or not about slave trade, but the slavery that was taken in Africa, and began to start using that towards their advantage in the sense that they would then buy these Africans at a cheap price and then carry them over to the New World to work for them on their plantations and bring back these raw materials back to Europe and so on. We'll get into a little bit more details about that here in a few minutes. So, as we said before, it was a triangular trade route between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And it kind of made and the reason why we call it the triangular trade because it made a triangular shape in the Atlantic Ocean, from which they were basically taking the Africans to the Americas. The Africans then would produce raw materials in the Americas. Those raw materials were taken back to Europe and then produced into final goods and then sold for a profit. And you guys will see that here in just a couple of minutes. So basically, in terms of the triangular trade route, as you can see, goods were sold to African leaders in exchange for the slaves. Once those slaves were purchased, then they were placed on boats, taken to the Americas or the West Indies, and the slaves were basically sold for things like sugarcane or other materials or even money, or even used to produce those raw materials to take back to Europe in terms of making raw materials and then making them into final products and then taking them and kind of starting the whole process all over again. So that is basically pretty much the triangular trade. And you'll see here in this next the triangular shape that it does make into the ocean or into the Atlantic Ocean. You guys can see from here how it kind of goes from the Americas or from Africa to the Americas, then Americas to back to Europe, and then from Europe into Africa. And the nice thing about this slide here is you can see that it talks about the slaves right here, the fact that things like cotton and sugar came from the Caribbean, things like tobacco, cotton, sugar, molasses came from the Americas, were all transferred to Europe, and then these manufactured goods that were created in Europe are then taken back to the Africas and sold for more slaves. So that's where they get the idea of the triangular trade. Now, the one thing about that, the middle portion of this, which was the second leg right here, which the slaves came from Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean, this is known as the Middle Passage. And this is the part which we watched the video over in class to discuss the conditions for the slaves. But the second leg was when the slaves were taken from Africa to the Americas is known as the Middle Passage. So that's one big thing to kind of understand and know as it relates. Okay, so like I said before, the middle leg of this journey to Africa by the Africans or the slaves was known as the Middle Passage. And as we said before, as I kind of talked about, the fact it was a very dehumanizing portion of the voyage. People were basically starved, in some cases given as minimal food as possible, forced to live in their own filth from time to time, and so on. Like we saw in the video, there was two types of ships that they could have traveled on. There was tight packers and there was loose packers. Tight packers were probably the worst of the two because of the fact that they packed as many slaves as humanly possible onto the ships, and as a result of that, they would build shelves, they would cram as many people in there, and very much gave them very little food. People often died from sickness and illness. If they got sick, they were often thrown off the boats and left to drown in the sea. Loose packers had less slaves in there, probably less people were dying on those ships, but they probably didn't make as much money as the tight packers did. So that was pretty much the big difference between those two. And like I said, the Middle Passage is that journey of the slaves across the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas. And once again, if we look back at this in terms of the conditions that they had to face on the Middle Passage, they were very tightly packed often. They were chained together. There was heat. Obviously, you guys can imagine how much body heat was probably in a boat like this. If you see down here with the picture of all the slaves in here, these are all slaves that are kind of packed together, and you can probably imagine that they were probably stacked on top of each other in terms of with the shelves. And it wasn't a very nice way of living in terms of being transported from one side of the Atlantic to the next. Lots of illness were a result of this. As I said before, they probably, if you got sick, were thrown overboard, or just, in order to prevent the illness from spreading. There were very rough seas, and the voyage lasted about 4 to 6 weeks in order to get from one side of the Atlantic to the other. So that's pretty much the slave trade, the Middle Passage, the triangular trade. I would definitely know those words. If you guys didn't catch that, know the Middle Passage, know what the triangular trade is, know the difference between tight packers and loose packers, all for the test that will be coming up here in the next week or so. So make sure that you guys answer the discussion question below, and look forward to you guys catching up on the next one, which will be over the Scramble for Africa. All right.